Well, when you become the news, you must get out of the news, and that is exactly what Brian Williams has done, announcing this weekend that he's going to step aside as the network does an internal investigation into his tall tales. Nonetheless, they're trying to clean up a mess. Let's bring in JJ McCullough to chat about a story. It's the gift that keeps giving, and I think Mark Stein had maybe the best response I've heard yet, saying maybe he is to anchors as Anthony Weiner is to wankers.
That's a pretty good line. Yeah. No, it definitely does seem like a pretty sort of damning episode that it'll be very difficult for him to recover from. Only because I think that a lot of people, a lot of your average news watchers, and in no way to insult the intelligence of the average news watcher, but I don't think that they really understand the difference between an anchorman and a reporter, and perhaps a news director and some of these other positions.
But they also can't also differentiate between, let's say, a Bill O'Reilly and a Brian Williams as to where they're different. One's opinion, one's an actual news guy.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact is that what Brian Williams did was basically he shared a kind of anecdotal story about his own life. And I mean, we all have a tendency, I think, to sort of sand the hard edges off our anecdotes when we're retelling a story, to make them to sort of a little bit more hyperbolic, a little bit more sensationalistic, so that they're more captivating to the audience that we're telling them to. Nevertheless, the fact that Williams has done this about a military incident, which has, issues of its own, has really insulted his, has really called into question his credibility. And the question is whether or not whether or not the audience can take seriously a man who lies in his own personal life when he's delivering the news on television night after night. It doesn't, again, Brian Williams is not fundamentally a reporter. He's not a man who's going out there and collecting the news stories in order to bring it to Mr. and Mrs. America. He's fundamentally a guy who's just reading a teleprompter of reporting that someone else has done. But nevertheless, the question is that his credibility as a voice of authority has been so contested that a lot of people are going to be inclined to not want to hear what he has to say on any issue going forward.
Yeah, I mean, look, now he's being investigated for several other stories that he told, apparently, back in 2006. I mean, there was the Katrina story where he was watching bodies go by, and then he got some illness that doesn't even exist in the area. And then there's this report coming out of the Boston Herald, which is not at all flattering, in 2006, where Brian Williams bailed as a master of ceremonies for the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, this convention that had 1,000 people at, and he bailed on it so he could appear on Saturday Night Live, and it did not go over well at all. But back then, who was going to believe that Brian Williams dissed this obligation to get some time on Saturday Night Live?
Yeah, and that's an interesting anecdote, though, isn't it? Because it does sort of suggest that Brian Williams has become this kind of celebrity force that's kind of independent of his obligations. I mean, he's on the Jon Stewart show all the time. I remember he used to be a sort of reoccurring character on 30 Rock, which was kind of this weird sort of phenomenon. But it is this kind of occurrence that a lot of these news anchor people have sort of just become this sort of celebrity brand unto themselves. They've been, well, I mean, Anderson Cooper's, a classic example as well, where like a lot of it is just they become these celebrities and you're interested in them and their personal lives, and as a result you become interested in their personal anecdotes, anecdotes that are not necessarily reporting, hard news reporting, but just stories about how they feel, or like if they were scared or if they were in danger, and just a little bits of local color and sort of fleshing out sort of the interesting world that they themselves are kind of a window into. And I think that just the dangers of that side of things, and how much that realm of one's life, which as I said is sort of subject to different rules than I think the rules of reporting, but how much that sort of celebrity cult and that sort of celebrity, all of that sort of stuff is now compromising anchor people's ability to do their own job. I think that this will beg a lot of questions about whether or not the sort of the modern day cult of the celebrity anchorman is, actually a liability to sensible journalism that actually has the public's trust at a time when network news, of course, has all sorts of existential problems.
Yeah, well, but who's going to believe him? Anytime he goes on talking about anything, everyone's going to start wondering, is this another tall tale? Now, look, he's not the first anchor that has made up tall tales. I will not say much more than that, but I've heard my share of stories that you go, that cannot be possibly true. I don't know if it's a question of ego gets so huge, or you just start really believing what you cover, and maybe it's like a stress, I don't know what you would call it, but you start really believing your own narrative. I don't know what it is, but he wouldn't be the first to make up a tall tale. in this business.
No, but what I do think is very critical is that it involved a story about the military, right?
Sure.
And I mean, what actually this brought to mind was, we may recall some months ago we were talking about that fellow in Ottawa who was wearing a fake uniform. Remember that? Fake medals and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's a real sort of sense that I think has a lot of people in the armed forces really sort of rankled that Brian Williams is in a way sort of stealing their valor, right? I mean, military, these kind of horror stories of what it's like to be in a war zone, I mean, they're very compelling to listen to, but they're also something that is very hard earned. I mean, it is very much the price of sacrificing yourself in a war zone that you get to come back and tell these kinds of stories that are very captivating. And then the idea of a guy like Brian Williams, who was, from all accounts, doesn't seem like he ever was in danger, nevertheless sort of claiming the mantle of that, sort of claiming to be on par with these many men and women who did sacrifice and were putting themselves in enormous danger. To me, I mean, it seems just as sort of unimpressive as someone who wears medals that he didn't earn. It's trying to opt into a culture that you have no right to opt into. And I think that's what makes this story much more damning to him than the Katrina story or any other sort of tall tale anecdote that he could possibly weave, just because the stakes are so much higher, the emotional investment is so much higher, and the valor that he's trying to claim is a valor that is so hard fought.
Yeah, and not to mention in his apology where he really played up to the military, saying how much he respects, and then to have this Boston Herald story out that he was willing to blow them off so that he could get some airtime with Saturday Night Live does not exactly present in a very favorable light. And so, does he survive this thing? I don't know how he can. I mean, knowing the way that the media works down there, he'll survive because they'll cover for him. But I tend to think that this is so toxic now that NBC is going to have to walk away.
Well, it's interesting. There's been very little sort of establishment support for him. I mean, he's been getting a real hard time in the rest of the media. There's no real sense that people are coming to his defense on the other networks, or people sort of making the case for, oh, he was under stress or whatever other sort of compelling counter arguments you would imagine. People are really piling on hard from the people that he needs his defense.
Show that they've lost it, and it'll be interesting to see if he becomes kind of that ongoing joke in shows like Saturday Night Live. If he becomes the butt of all sorts of jokes because of his bravado, I mean, it really is quite damaging to NBC.
I think it's possible that he could be like demoted to some very low level kind of thing where, he'll be a correspondent, or, he'll deliver the news at an unpopular time, or just like have his duties really, really cut back as a sort of first step towards phasing him out entirely. I do think it would probably be pretty damning for NBC to just, suffer the embarrassment of firing him outright. I do think it's possible he could just be demoted, but I do think that his career, certainly as the most trusted anchorman in America, and as America's sort of most beloved celebrity figure in the news, I do think those days are objectively over.
Of course they are. I mean, you've seen it on social media. They're superimposing him into scenes that there's no way he could like he was fighting the Nazis. I mean, he's done everything apparently because it's become such a big joke. But people really liked him, and I don't think they want to believe that he could be so foolish. And don't forget, there will be those behind the scenes that absolutely hate him enough to make sure that other things get out. And once it's like the Matt Lauer thing, once they start like leaking that kind of stuff out, that he's not the nicest guy, it's not going to play well for him.
No, and I mean, because there's a bit of, let's be frank, there's a bit of tall poppy syndrome going on here as well. People love to see people at the top fail the most spectacularly. So I do think that there's a bit of schadenfreude that is sort of propelling some of the eagerness to see the man fail. And I mean, as much as I think that the man has done disgraceful things, and I think he deserves what he has coming to him, that doesn't necessarily mean that all criticism of him is necessarily coming from the most wholesome place either. A lot of people do, as I said, like to see people at the top fail, and I think that there's a lot of joy in sort of being able to tear this man down.
Yeah, interesting times. Well, we'll see what happens to their beloved. I got to leave it there. Thank you, sir.